The waiter set the black leather check folder in the center of the table, right between the empty champagne bucket and the platter of lobster shells, and my mother slid it 3 inches to the left.
Toward me.
"You're paying, sweetheart," she said, not even looking up from her wine glass. "You know how this works."
I laughed.
I actually laughed because for half a second I thought it was a joke, the kind of joke my family made when they wanted something and didn't want to ask for it directly. But nobody else at the table laughed. My brother Grant was checking his phone. My sister Bailey was reapplying lip gloss using the reflection in her butter knife. My father was staring at the ice sculpture, like it might rescue him. And my mother, Diane, was simply waiting, the way she always waited when she already knew she'd won. I opened the folder. $4,112. 11 lobster tails. 3 bottles of champagne that cost more than my monthly car payment. A raw bar tower that nobody had asked for and everybody had eaten. A cake that said Happy 65th Walter in gold icing, ordered without a single conversation about who was covering it.
"There's 14 people here," I said.
"I didn't order half of this."
"You didn't have to order it," my mother said.
"Your family. Family takes care of family. I want you to understand something before I go any further." That sentence, "family takes care of family," was not new to me. I had heard some version of it my entire adult life. I had heard it when my brother needed $11,000 to keep his restaurant's walk-in cooler from being repossessed. I had heard it when my sister's wedding venue required a deposit 6 weeks before her fiancé's family figured out their side. I had heard it, quietly, almost gently, the year my father's heart surgery left a gap in the insurance that nobody wanted to say out loud. What I did not understand, what I would not understand for another 6 weeks, sitting at that same table with a folder full of bank statements instead of a folder full of a lobster bill, was that the sentence had never once meant what I thought it meant. It didn't mean we take care of each other. It meant you take care of us, and don't ask why it's always you. But that night, I didn't know any of that yet. That night, I just sat there with my card in my hand, my face hot, $4,100 staring up at me under warm restaurant lighting, and 12 relatives waiting to see what I would do. I put my card in the folder. I paid it. And that's the part of the story I want to start with, because everything that came after, everything you're about to hear, started at that table with that folder, with me doing exactly what I had always done. What I didn't know was that this dinner wasn't an accident. It wasn't a spontaneous overindulgence by a family celebrating my father's birthday. It had been planned,
discussed, timed.
And I was the only person at that table who didn't know it. Let me go back, because none of this makes sense unless you understand who I was before that night. My name is Claire. I'm 34. I'm a certified public accountant, which is either the funniest or the most tragic detail in this entire story, depending on how you look at it, because for over a decade, I managed other people's money for a living and somehow never once managed to protect my own for my family. I grew up in a split-level house outside Columbus, Ohio, the middle child between Grant, who is 3 years older, and Bailey, who is 4 years younger. If you'd asked anyone in our neighborhood to describe the three of us growing up, they would have used the same 3 words every single time. Grant was the golden one. Bailey was the baby. And I was the responsible one. I want you to notice that word. Responsible. It sounds like a compliment. For years, I thought it was. It wasn't until much later that I understood responsible was never really a description of my character.
It was a job assignment.
It was the role I got handed sometime around age 11, when my mother stopped asking if I could watch Bailey after school and started simply telling me I would. It was the role that meant when Grant crashed the family car 2 weeks before his 18th birthday, nobody sat him down and made him understand consequences, because boys are like that, my mother said, and besides, I was already there, 16 years old, quietly transferring babysitting money into an envelope marked Grant car without anyone ever formally asking me to. Nobody sits you down and tells you you're going to be the family's emergency fund. It happens gradually, one small moment of usefulness at a time, until one day you look up and 30 years have passed, and it's simply understood. Claire will handle it. Claire always handles it. I left for college with a partial scholarship and a determination to become someone whose worth wasn't measured by what she could fix. I studied accounting because I liked the certainty of numbers, the fact that a ledger, unlike a family, either balances or it doesn't, and there's no emotional argument that changes the math. I built a career. I bought a modest house 40 minutes outside the city with hardwood floors. I refinished myself over a long, lonely, satisfying summer. I told myself I had built a life that belonged to me. What I didn't understand, what took me years to understand, was that in my family's eyes, my stability wasn't something I had earned for myself. It was a resource, and resources exist to be used. The original wound, if I can call it that, happened when I was 26. My father had a heart attack in March of that year. Not fatal, thank God, but serious enough that he needed a bypass, serious enough that he was out of work for 4 months, serious enough that the gap between what his insurance covered and what the hospital demanded came to just under $18,000. I had $18,000. Not because I was wealthy. I was 26, 3 years into my first real accounting job, but because I had saved almost everything I made since college, living cheap, driving a used Corolla, telling myself I was building toward a down payment on a house. My mother called me on a Tuesday night in April. She didn't ask if I had the money. She told me the hospital had called again, and then she went quiet on the phone in a way that felt like a held breath, like the silence itself was the request. I wired the money the next morning. Nobody ever called it a loan. There was no paperwork, no interest, no agreed-upon repayment. And when, 3 years later, I gently brought up that I was still driving that same Corolla with 140,000 miles on it, still renting a one-bedroom apartment because I'd never fully rebuilt what I gave up, my mother looked at me with genuine, wounded confusion, as if I had insulted her. "Your father almost died, Claire," she said. "Is that really what you're worried about? Money?" And that was the moment, though I didn't recognize it as a moment at the time, that the rules of my family were quietly rewritten. Helping wasn't a gift I had chosen to give. It was a debt I would spend the rest of my life failing to fully repay, simply by existing as the person who could. Grant, meanwhile, opened his restaurant. I want to be fair to my brother, because this isn't a story about a villain twirling a mustache. Grant is charming in a way that has genuinely opened doors for him his entire life, the kind of charm that gets him extended credit at the bank, extra time on rent, second chances from people who should know better. He named the restaurant after our grandmother, which used to make me tear up a little before I understood how much of that sentimentality was strategic. The restaurant struggled almost from the beginning, in the quiet, grinding way that most small restaurants struggle. Inconsistent staffing, thin margins, a location that looked charming on Instagram and terrible for foot traffic. Every 6 or 8 months, there would be a crisis. The walk-in cooler, a liquor license renewal, a vendor threatening to cut off deliveries. And every single time, the family group chat would light up with the same rotating cast of characters expressing concern, followed, always, eventually, by a private message to me. "Just me. Can you talk to Grant? Mom thinks maybe you could help him figure something out." Figure something out was our family's dialect for send money. By the time of that birthday dinner, I estimated, and I want to be honest, I actually sat down one night that spring and calculated it because that's who I am, that I had given or loaned my family somewhere around $91,000 over 8 years. Not $1 of it had ever been repaid. Not one conversation had ever acknowledged it as debt. Bailey was different. Bailey's requests were smaller but constant, a steady drip instead of Grant's occasional flood. Rent short by $400. A car repair. A girl's trip she couldn't quite afford but desperately needed for her mental health, she said. And how could I argue with that? I want to tell you that I saw all of this clearly, that I understood the pattern and simply chose, out of love, to keep participating in it. That would make me sound wiser than I was. The truth is messier. The truth is that I loved my family and I was terrified, genuinely, physically terrified, of what would happen to that love if I stopped being useful to it. Some part of me, the part that was still 11 years old watching my mother's face when I agreed to babysit Bailey for the 4th night in a row, believed that my value in that family was conditional, that if I stopped paying, I would stop belonging. So when my father's 65th birthday came around that spring, and my mother started talking about doing something special, something he deserves, I didn't think twice about agreeing to help plan it. What I didn't know was that Help Planet already had a very specific meaning to everyone else at that table except me. 3 weeks before the dinner, I was staying at my parents' house for a weekend, sleeping in my old bedroom, which my mother had converted into a home office, but still called Claire's room. I got up around midnight for water and heard my mother's voice, low, coming from the kitchen. "She won't say no in front of everyone," she was saying. "That's the whole point of doing it at a restaurant instead of here." I stopped in the hallway.
I told myself it wasn't what it sounded like.
I told myself a lot of things that year that weren't true. "Grant, listen to me," she continued. "I recognize now it was a phone call. If we do this at the house, she can just leave or make an excuse or split it up so it doesn't feel like a big deal. If we're at Marchetti's, with your aunt and uncle there, with the Hendersons there, she's not going to make a scene. She never makes a scene." I stood in that dark hallway in my old bedroom's doorway for a long time. I told myself I'd misunderstood the context. I told myself she was talking about something else, splitting a bill for a hotel room, maybe, or a gift. I went back to bed. I did not confront her. I want to be honest with you about that because this isn't a story where I was some brilliant detective piecing together clues in real time. This is a story about a woman who heard something that should have changed everything and chose, for 3 more weeks, to pretend she hadn't. But the sentence stayed lodged in me. She never makes a scene. It sat there, quiet and sharp, like a splinter I kept forgetting was under the skin until I pressed on it by accident. Small things started to bother me after that. My mother mentioned, almost casually, that she'd invited the whole Henderson clan to the dinner. People I barely knew, my father's old co-workers and their extended families, easily adding 6 or 7 guests to what I had assumed would be an intimate dinner for the 5 of us plus a few close relatives. "That's a lot of people," I said. "Your father deserves a real celebration," she said. "We only turned 65 once." I noticed that nobody discussed a budget. I noticed that when I asked, gently, whether we should set a per-person spending guideline given how many people were coming, my mother waved her hand and said, "Don't be so clinical about it, Claire. It's your father's birthday, not a spreadsheet." I noticed that Grant, who complained constantly about money, was suddenly enthusiastic about upgrading the restaurant choice from a mid-range Italian place to Marchetti's, an upscale seafood steakhouse downtown known for a raw bar and a wine list that required its own separate menu. Each of these things on its own was nothing. A family being a little extravagant for a milestone birthday. It was only later, once I understood the full shape of what was happening, that I could look back and see them as what they actually were. Small, deliberate turns of a key in a lock that had been built for exactly this purpose. 2 days before the dinner, I found the real reason. I'd gone to my parents' house to drop off a birthday gift for my father, a leather-bound journal, the kind of gift you give a man who says he doesn't want anything because you know he secretly likes to write down memories he'll never admit he's sentimental about. My mother wasn't home. My father was napping. I let myself in with my key, and while I was looking for a pen to leave a note, I saw an envelope on the kitchen counter, addressed to Grant, from a business lending company I recognized. I'd worked with them professionally, years earlier, doing tax prep for a client. I want to be clear that I did not go looking for this. I have never in my life gone through my family's mail. But the envelope was already open, and a single page had slid halfway out, and the words, "Personal Guarantor," were visible before I ever made a conscious decision to read them. I read it. I'm not going to apologize for that. I think, somewhere underneath the guilt I felt in the moment, some part of me already suspected I needed to. It was a loan renewal notice for Grant's restaurant. $62,000, already extended twice, now requiring either full repayment within 30 days or a new personal guarantor with sufficient assets to co-sign, because Grant's own credit, after years of missed payments, could no longer secure it alone. At the bottom of the page, in my mother's handwriting, in the margin were 3 words. "Ask Claire Saturday." Sat, I realized, standing in my parents' kitchen with my father's birthday journal still in my hand, meant Saturday. The night of the dinner. I put the letter back exactly where I found it. I left the journal on the counter with a note I don't remember writing. I drove home and sat in my car in my own driveway for 40 minutes without going inside because I could not, at that moment, figure out how to hold what I now understood. This wasn't a birthday dinner. It was a stage. My mother had chosen the restaurant, the guest list, the size of the event, specifically to create a room full of witnesses in which I would be far too uncomfortable to say no. First to an inflated bill I hadn't agreed to, softening me up, and then, once I'd already demonstrated in front of everyone that I would pay rather than cause a scene, to the much larger ask waiting behind it. $62,000. My name on a loan for a business that was, by any honest accounting, already failing. I didn't sleep much that week. I want to tell you, I marched into that dinner with a plan, cool and composed, ready for battle. That's not what happened. What happened is I went, because not going would have required an explanation I wasn't ready to give, and because some small, stubborn part of me needed to see it play out with my own eyes before I could fully believe it. I needed proof that wasn't a slip of paper on a kitchen counter. I needed to watch it happen. And it happened exactly the way I now understood it had been designed to happen. The bill came. $4,100 for food and drink I hadn't ordered, at a restaurant I hadn't chosen, for a guest list I hadn't approved, in front of 14 people including my father's old co-workers and their spouses, none of whom had any idea they were props in a plan. You're paying, sweetheart. You know how this works. I paid it. I told you that already. I want you to sit with that for a second because I did. I sat with it in the parking lot afterward, alone, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel, replaying the entire night. My father hugging me a little too tightly at the end, saying, "You always take such good care of us, Claire Bear," a nickname he hadn't used since I was maybe 9 years old. My mother's small, satisfied smile when I handed the folder back to the waiter. Grant, who hadn't said a single word to me all night beyond "hey" and "thanks for tonight," already halfway out the door before I'd even signed the receipt. I thought about the letter on the counter. Ask Claire Saturday. They hadn't asked. Not yet. I understood, sitting there in the dark, that the lobster bill wasn't the actual test. It was the rehearsal. The real ask, the $62,000 ask, was coming and probably coming soon, and it was going to arrive wrapped in exactly the same paper this one had: family, love, obligation, and a room full of people who would make it feel impossible to say no. That's when I stopped being sad and started being something else. I don't know if clarity is the right word, exactly, but it's the closest one I have. I remember sitting in that parking lot and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could name, completely and totally awake. I didn't do anything dramatic in the days that followed. I didn't call my mother screaming. I didn't post anything online. I didn't even bring it up. Instead, I did the thing I actually know how to do. I gathered information. I pulled 8 years of bank records, my own. Thank God I keep meticulous records, it's basically an occupational hazard, and built a spreadsheet. Every transfer, every date, every stated reason where I had won. $91,340, going back to that first $18,000 wire the week of my father's surgery. I printed it. I don't know why printing it mattered to me so much, but it did. Something about holding physical proof of 8 years of my own life made it feel real, in a way that a phone screen never could. I also called a lending officer I knew from my work, someone who had no connection to my family at all, and asked her, hypothetically, what it would mean to co-sign a personal guarantee on a small business loan that was already in its second renewal with missed payments on record. Hypothetically, she said, with the particular gentleness people use when they already suspect the hypothetical isn't hypothetical at all, it would mean you're not helping him get a loan. You're becoming personally liable for a loan he's already failed to pay back twice. If the business goes under, and Claire, a restaurant on its third renewal with this payment history, statistically it's probably going under, the bank comes after whoever signed. Not him. Whoever has the assets. Which, from what you've told me, would be you. I remember thanking her and hanging up and sitting very still at my kitchen table for a long time. I also, and this part I'm less proud of, but I think it matters to the story, called my sister. I chose Bailey because, out of everyone in my family, she was the one I thought might actually tell me the truth if I asked her directly, without an audience, without my mother in the room managing the narrative. I was right, though not entirely in the way I expected. I knew there was a whole thing about the restaurant, Bailey admitted, quietly over the phone. Mom's been stressed about it for months. She kept saying you'd want to help once you understood how bad it was. Like she needed you to not know how bad it actually was until the timing was right. I didn't know about the dinner being planned like that.
I swear, Claire. I thought it was just a birthday thing.
I believed her. I still believe her. Bailey has her own complicated relationship with our mother, her own smaller version of the role I'd been assigned, and I don't think she was lying to me. But I also noticed, and this stayed with me, that even once she knew, even once I told her what I'd read on that letter, she didn't call my mother to confront her. She didn't tell me to refuse. She said, and I remember this exactly, just, maybe don't make it a whole thing. You know how Mom gets. You're paying, sweetheart. You know how this works.
I paid it. I told you that already.
I want you to sit with that for a second because I did. I sat with it in the parking lot afterward, alone, engine off, hands still on the steering wheel, replaying the entire night. My father hugging me a little too tightly at the end, saying, "You always take such good care of us, Claire Bear," a nickname he hadn't used since I was maybe 9 years old. My mother's small, satisfied smile when I handed the folder back to the waiter. Grant, who hadn't said a single word to me all night beyond "hey" and "thanks for tonight," already halfway out the door before I'd even signed the receipt. I thought about the letter on the counter. Ask Claire Saturday. They hadn't asked. Not yet. I understood, sitting there in the dark, that the lobster bill wasn't the actual test. It was the rehearsal. The Real ask, the $62,000 ask, was coming and probably coming soon, and it was going to arrive wrapped in exactly the same paper this one had: family, love, obligation, and a room full of people who would make it feel impossible to say no. That's when I stopped being sad and started being something else. I don't know if clarity is the right word exactly, but it's the closest one I have. I remember sitting in that parking lot and feeling, for the first time in longer than I could name, completely and totally awake. I didn't do anything dramatic in the days that followed. I didn't call my mother screaming. I didn't post anything online. I didn't even bring it up. Instead, I did the thing I actually know how to do. I gathered information. I pulled 8 years of bank records, my own. Thank God I keep meticulous records, it's basically an occupational hazard, and built a spreadsheet. Every transfer, every date, every stated reason where I had won $91,340, going back to that first $18,000 wire the week of my father's surgery. I printed it. I don't know why printing it mattered to me so much, but it did. Something about holding physical proof of 8 years of my own life made it feel real in a way that a phone screen never could. I also called a lending officer I knew from my work, someone who had no connection to my family at all, and asked her hypothetically what it would mean to co-sign a personal guarantee on a small business loan that was already in its second renewal with missed payments on record. Hypothetically, she said, with the particular gentleness people use when they already suspect the hypothetical isn't hypothetical at all, it would mean you're not helping him get a loan. You're becoming personally liable for a loan he's already failed to pay back twice. If the business goes under, and Claire, a restaurant on its third renewal with this payment history, statistically it's probably going under, the bank comes after whoever signed. Not him. Whoever has the assets. Which, from what you've told me, would be you. I remember thanking her and hanging up and sitting very still at my kitchen table for a long time. I also, and this part I'm less proud of, but I think it matters to the story, called my sister. I chose Bailey because, out of everyone in my family, she was the one I thought might actually tell me the truth if I asked her directly, without an audience, without my mother in the room managing the narrative. I was right, though not entirely in the way I expected. I knew there was a whole thing about the restaurant, Bailey admitted, quietly over the phone. Mom's been stressed about it for months. She kept saying you'd want to help once you understood how bad it was. Like she needed you to not know how bad it actually was until the timing was right. I didn't know about the dinner being planned like that.
I swear, Claire. I thought it was just a birthday thing.
I believed her. I still believe her. Bailey has her own complicated relationship with our mother, her own smaller version of the role I'd been assigned, and I don't think she was lying to me. But I also noticed, and this stayed with me, that even once she knew, even once I told her what I'd read on that letter, she didn't call my mother to confront her. She didn't tell me to refuse. She said, and I remember this exactly, just, maybe don't make it a whole thing. You know how Mom gets. Claire, he said, nobody's trying to trap you. Dad, I said, and my voice cracked a little, which I hadn't planned on. Mom picked the restaurant specifically because she thought I wouldn't say no in front of a crowd. I heard her say it on the phone to Grant, 3 weeks before your birthday. She wasn't planning a party. She was planning an ambush, and it just happened to have a cake in it. I watched something shift in my father's face, not disbelief, exactly, but a kind of tired recognition, like a man seeing a pattern he'd spent years choosing not to look at directly. He didn't defend her. He didn't defend me either, not out loud, not in that moment. He just sat down slowly at the kitchen table and said, quietly, I didn't know about the letter. I believed him. I still do. I told them both, as calmly as I could manage, that I would not be co-signing the loan. I explained because I am an accountant, and explaining is what I know how to do when I don't know how to simply feel a thing out loud, that a business on its third loan renewal with a documented history of missed payments was not a business I could responsibly attach my name to, not because I didn't love my brother, but because doing so would very likely cost me my house, my savings, and my own financial stability, for a business that the numbers suggested was not going to recover regardless of what I did. So you'd let him lose everything, my mother said again, to protect your own money. I'd let him face the consequences of a business that's been failing for 3 years, I said, the same way I've had to face consequences my entire life, for things that weren't always my fault either. I'm not the emergency fund anymore, Mom. I never should have been one to begin with. She didn't cry. I think part of me expected her to, and part of me had braced myself against it, because tears had always been one of the most effective tools in that house, more effective, honestly, than any argument. But she didn't cry. She looked at me instead with something that took me a long time afterward to name, and when I finally did, the word I landed on was betrayed, as if I were the one who had broken an agreement, rather than the one who had just discovered, after 8 years, what the agreement had actually cost me. You've changed, she said. No, I said, and this is the part of the conversation I've thought about more than any other since. I don't think I've changed at all, Mom. I think for the first time, you're seeing me say no, and it feels like a change because you've never had to see it before. I left not long after that. Grant called me twice that evening. I let both calls go to voicemail. The first message was angry, accusing me of abandoning him, of caring more about a spreadsheet than my own brother, of always thinking I was better than everyone else because I made good choices, as if choices were the only variable, as if I hadn't spent 8 years quietly subsidizing the consequences of his. The second message, left 40 minutes after the first, was different. Quieter, he admitted, in a voice that sounded genuinely tired rather than performed, that the restaurant had been losing money for over a year, that he'd known the loan renewal was unlikely to be approved without a cosigner, that some small part of him had known asking me was unfair, even as he let our mother arrange the dinner to make it easier. I didn't stop her, he said near the end of the message. I want you to know that. I knew what she was planning, and I didn't stop her, because I needed it to work. I'm sorry, Claire. I really am. I didn't call him back that night. I needed time before I could hear that apology without also hearing everything underneath it. The restaurant closed 11 weeks later. I want to tell you that without co-signing, Grant found another solution, some alternate path that saved everything without costing me anything, but that would be a lie, and I promised myself when I started being honest about my family that I would stay honest about how this actually ended, not how I wish it had. The bank declined to renew without a qualifying co-signer. Grant tried, briefly, to find another investor, another lender, another version of me. He didn't find one. The restaurant our grandmother's name had hung above for 6 years closed on a Tuesday in late autumn, and I heard about it not from Grant, but from Bailey, who texted me a single photograph of the dark storefront with the neon sign unlit, and no caption at all. I felt many things reading that text. Grief, for a place that had genuinely meant something to my family, even if it had also meant a decade of quiet exploitation. Guilt, even though I know, that I did not close that restaurant. A failing business closed a failing business. I only stopped being the reason it stayed open past the point it should have. And underneath the grief and the guilt, something else. Something that took me weeks to admit to myself, because it felt so unkind to feel it about my own brother's loss. Relief. Not relief that Grant had lost something he loved. I want to be very clear about that. But relief that I was no longer the invisible foundation holding up a structure that was always, eventually going to fall. Relief that when it did fall, it fell as itself, honestly, instead of taking me down with it disguised as an act of love. My mother didn't speak to me for almost 4 months. That silence was its own kind of information. In 34 years, I had never once had a 4-month gap in contact with my mother, not during college, not during the worst years of my 20s, not ever. It told me something I think I'd always suspected but had never let myself fully believe, that a significant portion of our relationship had been built on my usefulness, and that when the usefulness stopped, so, largely, did the relationship. It was my father who called first on a Sunday evening in February, almost 5 months after that birthday dinner. He didn't apologize exactly, not in the direct, tidy way you'd want in a story like this one. What he did instead was ask me to have coffee with him, just the two of us, at a diner near my house, nowhere near my mother's good ceramic mugs. We sat in a booth by the window, and he was quiet for a long time before he spoke. "I used to tell myself I didn't know how bad it was," he finally said. "How much you were caring for this family. But I think I did know, Claire. I think I just let myself not look at it too closely because looking at it too closely would have meant I had to do something about it, and I didn't know how." I didn't say anything. I let him keep going. "Your grandmother used to say something," he said, "back when you kids were little. I don't think you remember her well enough to remember this part. She used to say, family isn't the people who take from you because they know you'll let them. Family is the people who give freely because giving is a choice, not a debt." He turned his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. "I think somewhere along the way, we forgot that in our house. I think we turned you into someone who had to give, instead of someone who got to choose. And I'm sorry. I should have seen it a long time before that dinner." I still have that leather journal I gave him for his birthday, or rather, I know he still has it because he showed it to me that day at the diner, 3 pages filled already, in his careful, old-fashioned handwriting, mostly memories of my grandmother, 1 page near the middle simply titled, in block letters, "Things I should have said to Claire sooner." I won't tell you my mother and I fully repaired everything because we haven't, not entirely, and I think honesty requires me to say that. We talk now, carefully, the way you talk to someone you love but no longer entirely trust with the parts of yourself that are easy to exploit. She has never fully acknowledged the dinner was staged, not in so many words, though she did once, in a stiff, uncomfortable phone call last spring, say something close to it. "I only did what I thought I had to do for your brother. I know now it wasn't fair to you." It wasn't the apology I might have written for her if I'd been scripting the scene myself, but it was something. It was more honesty than I'd gotten from her in 8 years, and I've learned to let something be enough, some days, instead of holding out for everything. Grant and I are still rebuilding slowly. He's working as a line cook now at someone else's restaurant, no longer the owner, no longer the golden one, everyone quietly protected from consequences. There's something almost peaceful in the way he talks about it now, less performance in his voice than I ever remember hearing before. I think losing the restaurant cost him something he needed to lose, as strange and unfair as that is to say about my own brother's dream. Bailey and I are closer than we've ever been, oddly enough. I think watching what happened to me, watching me finally say no and survive it and come out the other side still whole, gave her permission to start saying smaller no's of her own. Last month, she turned down a request from our mother to help cover a family trip she couldn't actually afford. It was a small thing. It mattered enormously to me. As for me, I still see my family. I still love them. In the complicated, imperfect way you love people who have hurt you without ever fully deciding to be your enemy. But I no longer answer the phone assuming I already know what they need from me. I no longer treat every family gathering as a bill I haven't seen yet. I kept the spreadsheet, by the way. $91,340. I never sent it to anyone. I never asked anyone to repay it. I kept it, I think, because for 8 years I didn't have proof that what I felt was real, and now I do, filed away in a folder on my laptop I hope I never need to open again. Sometimes I think about that folder the waiter set down on the table that night, the black leather one with the check for $4,112 inside it, sliding across white tablecloth toward the one person in the family who had never once, not once, been asked if she wanted the role she'd been given. I think about my grandmother's sentence, The one my father finally gave back to me 5 months too late to save that dinner, but exactly in time to save everything after it. Family isn't the people who take from you because they know you'll let them. It's the people who give freely because giving is a choice. I'm still learning what it means to be someone who gets to choose. Some days I get it right. Some days the old instinct still rises up before I can stop it. The urge to smooth things over, to reach for my card before anyone even asks, to make myself smaller so the room stays comfortable for everyone else. But I notice it now. That's the difference. I notice it, and I get to decide every single time whether I'm giving because I love someone or paying because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't. If you've ever been the one in your family who always pays, always fixes, always shows up so everyone else doesn't have to, I hope you know it was never actually love that put you in that role. Love doesn't need a spreadsheet to prove it exists. If this story felt familiar to you in any way, I'd love to hear in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed because there are a lot more folders, a lot more tables, and a lot more people learning, a little late but not too late, exactly what they're worth.